Hi guys, welcome to lesson 10 of our resource management unit. For this topic we're going to be looking at something called a water transfer project. Now we have looked at water transfer project very briefly before. We're going to recap that before looking at a case study in the south of Africa. As always, your activity is to watch this video and complete any questions as instructed. And then finally, at the end, there are 3 review questions. I would like to attach your answers to those questions and upload them to Satchel 1 once you are finished. So before we start off, from the previous lesson we were looking at strategies used to reduce water insecurity. And there's a question on the board here. One of these is correct of the 2 strategies we looked at. It could be number 1, dams and river pumping, 2, dams and resalination, 3, dams and desalination, and 4, resalination and river pumping. I want to pause the video now and see which number you think is correct, and unpause once you've had a go at that. Okay. Hopefully you will have gone for option number 3, dams and desalination. And if you recall, in the last lesson we looked in some detail at these 2 methods. So the idea of a dam was that it blocked the flow of the water to create a reservoir behind it, which then allows us to kind of store up our water and manage the flow of rivers as well. And we also looked at something called desalination. Now, desalination was the idea that we could actually extract the salt from the seawater, and by doing so, that would enable us to convert it into fresh drinking water. But obviously, both these methods were very, very expensive, and the method we look at today is also very expensive. But desalination, for example, can only really be done in countries with a very high income. So HICs like Israel are using quite a lot of desalination, where it's not an appropriate method of obtaining safe water for lots of other countries in the world. And if you recall, that means that they are still in economic water scarcity. So they're the 2 methods we looked at in the previous lesson. Today, we're going to look at a third method, and it's something called a water transfer scheme. Now, a water transfer scheme is basically exactly what it says on the tin. It's transferring water from one area to another. Now, that area can be across a country, it can be across a county, or, as we're going to look at today, it could be between different countries or indeed across an entire continent. So water is transferred on a much more regular basis than we think. The water that you guys are drinking today, that is used in your shower, in your cup of tea, in your juice that you're having, that water does not come from Liverpool or St Helens. The water that we drink will most likely either come from North Wales or it will come from the Lake District, because that's where our water projects are, our reservoirs, our dams, etc. And so, on a small level, we are all in this country party to a water transfer scheme. But on a much wider level, I just want to go through the proper definition of that. So, a water transfer simply means moving water from an area of surplus to one which has a water deficit. So, for example, it might be that on this map here, the area in red is where there is a water shortage in the UK, and the area in Wales over there is very mountainous, so the water might be transferred from this area to this area. And in the UK, this is actually a lot more common, as I was saying a minute ago, than we think. So, for example, the blue dots on that line there, they are showing where the major reservoirs are. The red dots are showing major cities, and then the 2 lines what we're interested in. So the black lines are showing where water transfer schemes already happen. And you can see that there are transfer schemes around London in particular. There are transfer schemes in Birmingham. So for example, if you follow the line there, Birmingham in the centre of this map will be getting its water from central Wales. We can see that the water North Wales here would go to the Liverpool region. Manchester gets a large amount of its water from the Lake District and Cumbria, and London as well transferred from other parts of the country. They're also proposing different water transfer routes, so more water out of Wales to places like Bristol. And there's even this idea here, the Kielder Reservoir, that would actually potentially transfer water all the way down to London, because The south of the UK is in water deficit, whereas the north is very much in water surplus. Okay? But water transfer is not just happening in this country, it's also happening on a much bigger scale in other countries as well. So what we're going to look at here is a place called Lesotho, and the highlands in Lesotho. Now we're going to look at Lesotho on a map, but essentially this case study focuses on a water supply conflict and the solution between South Africa and Lesotho. And essentially the solution is this big water transfer project from the highlands of the country. So this is a map here, and you can see that this is South Africa, on the southern tip of the African continent, and this here is Lesotho, a very, very small country in the middle of South Africa. Geographically, it's a very weird example. There are very few countries which are entirely bordered by another. Lesotho is one of them. And throughout its history, there's been a bit of water conflict between these two countries. Because what's special about Lesotho is that Lesotho is an area of water surplus. And the area around Lesotho has been an area of drought for quite some time. So because Lesotho is so mountainous, it receives really, really high levels of rainfall. So Lesotho receives this natural water surplus, whereas areas around it in South Africa receive a water deficit. Now, this has caused problems because over the years there was a lot of debate and argument about whether that water should then be used to help South Africans as well. And the South African government were really, really keen to make sure that they would enable their country to have a steady water supply and be able to achieve water security. And they came up with a solution that would essentially involve piping the water from Lesotho into other parts of South Africa. And we're going to look at what that scheme entailed, and then we'll look at the advantages and disadvantages of it. So, one of the main infrastructure developments of this project was the Katsi Dam, which is imaged here. And in terms of imagery, I think that's quite a powerful image. You can see the mountainous regions of Lesotho. So they are very, very high in terms of relief. So building a dam in that area must have been very, very expensive. But this reservoir here is used to store the water that's kind of rained into those mountains. And that water is then piped off to other parts of South Africa to achieve their water security. And so you can see on this map here the general gist of what is happening. So we know that water is transferred from Lesotho to South Africa. And it is a huge infrastructure project, including dams, reservoirs, and tunnels. And on the map here, you can see those red lines are showing where the tunnels have been built to move the water out of Lesotho and into South Africa. You can also see where dams have been built to block the natural flow of the rivers, which have enabled those reservoirs to then occur, which allow that water transfer to happen. And so on paper, this scheme was a really, really good idea because the infrastructure development for Lesotho was very, very good, and South Africa would get water. But as always, we've really got to be careful when evaluating this sort of scheme because it has both positives and negative impacts. So, for example, looking at the advantages of the scheme, in the first place, it was very, very good because 20,000 jobs were created for the scheme. Because in order to build the massive tunnels, the reservoirs, and the dams, a huge workforce was needed, and that was really, really good for Lesotho because it enabled the people there to gain jobs. And as we know already from our development unit, that would then create a positive multiplier effect because if people had jobs, they would spend more money in the economy, so the government would raise more tax, invest more in infrastructure, so there are more jobs, and the cycle goes on. So for at least Lesotho's development is a very, very good thing. Another way to evaluate it was to actually look at the fact that access to safe water in South Africa increased by quite a lot after the scheme. In the first year after the scheme, the access to safe water increased from 83% to 87%. Now, that's not a huge percentage increase, was it a 5% increase? However, we've got to understand that that 5% of an entire country is really, really large. That's hundreds of thousands of people that are now accessing safe water as a direct result of that scheme. And in terms of if you're wondering, well, what does Lesotho get out of this? Well, South Africa pay them $1.5 million a month for the water. So Lesotho get this kind of standing order from South Africa, and they could then, in theory, use that money as a kind of foreign aid to improve their healthcare, to improve their education, and to improve their development of their country. Because Lesotho is very much an LIC, whereas South Africa is an NEE, with some parts that are actually quite wealthy as well. And so they're the advantages of the scheme. You can see that in terms of jobs, in terms of safe water, and in terms of the economic impact on Lesotho, it's all been very positive. However, there were some obvious disadvantages as well. So when they were building all these dams and reservoirs and tunnels, 20,000 people were displaced, which meant they had to leave their homes. Entire villages were abandoned, and there's quite a lot of resentment about that at the time because people had been living in these areas in Lesotho for generation after generation, and suddenly, because of this new project, they would then have to leave. Secondly, there is still water insecurity in Lesotho. Since the project started, there's been quite a few articles released that basically slam the scheme because in Lesotho, the country, there are actually people who struggle to access safe water. Now you can see the irony that Lesotho are shipping out water to South Africa when there's people in their own country who don't have access to safe water. Now, that's an obvious disadvantage. I want to play devil's advocate a little bit here and wonder whether, without the help from South Africa, if they'd be able to afford the water scheme in the first place. So, again, it links back to this idea of economic water insecurity because even though the South Africa are helping Lesotho with this, they're still not able to fully utilize the natural resource that they have. And then finally, as a result of the scheme, the cost of water actually increased in both South Africa and Lesotho. So again, I know it's better to have safe water, obviously, but the cost of that per litre water did increase slightly in both countries, which for some people wasn't a very good thing if they were already there or thereabouts on the poverty line. So hopefully you have understood the majority of what was going on in that video today then. So the three review questions, as always, what I would like you to do is I'd like you to answer these in full sentences and then upload them onto Satchel 1 so I can have a look through them. So the first question is, what is a water transfer scheme? So I want the proper definition, and if you want to go on and explain it in more detail, that would be really good as well. Second question, why is water transferred from Lesotho to South Africa? So looking at it on both sides, why does Lesotho transfer water and why does South Africa need the water? What about the physical and the human geography influences on that decision? And then finally, what are two advantages and two disadvantages of the project? So again, think of this like an argument. So that in full sentences, maybe a paragraph on the advantages and a paragraph on the disadvantages. And then once you've done that, you can upload it. As always, if there are any questions about this, you are more than free to join the Zoom link for some extra support.